What you are about to hear may include disturbing descriptions of sexual or physical abuse, or may contain coarse language. Listener discretion is advised.
The Junction neighborhood and its history were such important elements of the stories we told on Season 1 of Chasing Enlightenment. So for this bonus episode, we wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive into the neighborhood's colorful, fascinating history. To help us with this, I'll be joined by local historian Neil Ross. Neil used to offer historical walking tours of the Junction, so he's the perfect person to walk us through the neighborhood's story.
It's going to be fierce up there. 10,000 men out on a tear. Last call before the Junction goes dry. There's mud in the streets. There's mud in your eye.
What historical event is Neil describing there? Keep listening to find out. This is a bonus episode of Chasing Enlightenment Season 1, The Junction's 100-Year Hangover. So Neil, thanks very much for joining me for this episode today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Dan.
To begin, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your own interest in Junction history?
Sure. I'm a writer, performer with a background in comedy, but a great love of history. I moved to the Junction in 1992. And just gradually got interested in the history of where I lived. And I still live in the Junction and write and perform here. But Junction history remains a fascinating subject to me.
So jumping into Junction history then, could you start by telling me a bit about what the Junction was like around the turn of the century before the area became dry? How would you describe the character of the neighborhood at that time?
At the time that the Junction chose to go with the local option to ban the sale of alcohol within its jurisdiction, it was a thriving industrial town. So it's the coming of the railway that gives the town its birth. It was very much a railway town. The CPR repair yards were here, the Canadian Pacific Railway repair yards, and the Union Stockyards were here. And serving this fairly active technological community were 6 taverns. And there were a number of industrial accidents connected to these sites. And we started to see a movement within the community connecting with the Greater Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the only organization in North America advocating for women's suffrage. And the view at the time was that alcohol and industry were ruining the family and creating widows and orphans. And the Junction was just a place where this idea caught on, perhaps because of a brutal murder that occurs in 1898. Joseph Curley is a young father, a widower, who's coming home from drinking in the Subway tavern in the Junction, and he is viciously waylaid by persons unknown. And this murder, particularly, I think, because it left his children orphaned again, has a lot of resonance in the Junction, and this idea that drink doesn't mix with the kind of industrial situation that we have starts to become very prevalent, to the point where the Reverend Shaw, a Methodist minister, preaches a famous sermon, the Harlotry, Iniquity, and Vice sermon, where he calls for this modern Sodom and Gomorrah to rid itself of alcohol. And shortly after that, there's a brawl at the Hayden House between CPR workers and Union Stockyard workers, reportedly over a prostitute. And these three moments, the death of Curly, the harlotry, iniquity, and vice sermon, and the Hayden House brawl are in the minds of Junctionites when they vote in 1903 to ban the sale of alcohol within their, at that point, city boundaries.
And so the murder that you mentioned, that was never solved?
No, it was never solved.
And why did it get connected to alcohol then?
I think it was just, there was already a sentiment politically festering that alcohol was a dangerous thing in an environment like this. And if drink and the bars would lead to the death of this young father, then it's something we need to seriously reconsider in our community. I don't know, other than that, why that particular event would have been as jarring to the community, but it's often cited as it was one of the incidents that started the Junction on the road to the local option.
Now, on the podcast, one thing we talked about in episode 1 was how the night before the Junction became dry, a crowd of, I think it was 10,000 people kind of descended on the town and had their one last hurrah before the bars all closed. How did that come about? Were those people who were from the Junction, or were they people from outside the Junction, or what's the story there?
Well, it gives a reflection on how wild the Junction had to be to shut down its own bars, because when it decided to do so, a significant portion of the rounders and ruffians in downtown Toronto decided to come out and toast the town one last time. Now, what led to it in a big way was that there was an election in Toronto at the time, and the legislation was that you couldn't sell alcohol when you were running an election. So the chance to come out and have one last drink in the Junction, especially when there are no drinks at all to be had in downtown Toronto, led to what newspaper accounts from the time claim were 10,000 men descending on the Junction. Now, I've read the accounts, and you sort of get the feeling that the reporters themselves were imbibing highly, but 10,000. I think the police may have corroborated a 10,000 figure, but it was a heck of a night. And I wrote a short poem about it. If you'll indulge me, I'll recite it for you.
That would be great.
Okay. It's going to be fierce up there. 10,000 men out on a tear. CPR boys loaded for bear. Last call before the Junction goes dry. There's mud in the streets. There's mud in your eye. Great Canadian party, all the way to Runnymede. You hear up the rebellion, but God save the Queen. So it was a wild night. Chief Royce had only a very small contingent of police to keep the peace. I think they only arrested a small handful, but it was the Junction's great night of party.
Now, Neil, you've coined the phrase the 100-year hangover to describe the period of the Junction that came next. So could you tell me about some of the ways the Junction changed after the neighborhood became dry?
Well, the hangover doesn't set in as immediately as you might think, at least in terms of what the next development in the Junction is. And that's, miraculously, it replaces its bars with theaters. Whereas there were 6 bars in leading up to the local option, there's soon a full-fledged theater district in the Junction with 5 theaters, and this is where the focus of the community and the economy shifts for a while. Most notably is a theater called the Beaver on Dundas near Pacific, which is, I've seen photographs of it. It's absolutely gorgeous. So there is this vibrant theater district in the Junction that also is staging or housing repertory companies, touring vaudeville shows, local entertainment, and so there is an entertainment boom in the Junction for several years, but the hangover does set in, and we do see an increase in crime, particularly up to around through the 50s and the 60s. It's a very depressed area. It's not prohibition in the American sense because, you can just get outside of the jurisdiction, just onto to Jane Street, where the LCBO there had, during the years that the junction was dry, the highest sales of alcohol in the province. So you can see that the people in the junction were well supplied when, to get out of your dry area, you've only, in some cases, got to go a couple of 100 yards down the road. But there is no doubt about it that the community suffers for it, and it's kind of an unpleasant place to live for a number of years in the latter part of the 20th century. And during this period, there are a great rivalry between the wets and the dries, because this goes to plebiscite, to referendum, a couple of times. And the wet sides are led, as you might imagine, by local restaurateurs. And there's a gentleman by the name of Bill Temple, Temperance Willie, as he's known, who is another in this line of principled temperance crusaders. The temperance movement often, as I say, is aligned with votes for women, but also with standards in industry, higher wages for workers, and just the notion that alcohol and machinery don't mix. And under the leadership of Bill Temple, continues to win this battle. Long after his death in, I believe, 1985. And it's not until, I think, 1994 that the west side of the junction eventually rescinds the local option and goes wet, whereas Gus on the other side of Kiel had to fight a further 4 years to 2000 before that side of the junction could get a drink legally.
And now you kind of briefly touched on this a minute ago, but on the podcast, we referred to this 100-year hangover period as a period of prohibition. But I've learned that locals don't generally use that word.
It really is because the word has an American connotation and sort of brings up an Al Capone type imagery that people just tend to talk about the dry period or the local option period, because it's just not quite the same when, as we've said, you can just go down the street in some parts of the junction, buy a bottle, bring it back to the junction. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Technically, it was prohibition. The sale of alcohol was prohibited in the junction jurisdiction, but for that reason, perhaps because of its American connotations, they don't use the term prohibition that much.
And besides, going down the street outside of the junction and being able to buy alcohol there, were there any other ways that you know of people, finding ways to get around the ban on the sale of alcohol?
Yeah, I mean, as they would have anywhere, there were speakeasies, blind pigs, often just in people's homes, and I think there are probably a number of backyard stills as well. People, junction people have always been resourceful.
Now, how would you describe how the junction has changed from the 90s to today? Do you think that bringing alcohol into the junction influenced the evolution of the neighborhood over the last 20 years or so?
Oh, yeah, I think so. That there was a nightlife that could start to grow here, that one didn't feel restricted if one went to a restaurant, and the time that this change happened, the junction housing boom kind of was kickstarted because people now felt it was not only a place to live and bring up their kids, but where they could pleasantly hang out, in the evenings.
And one thing that some locals have told me a bit about is, you mentioned the Stockyards as one of the industries that used to be in the area. I've heard descriptions of the Stockyards as, producing this foul stench that wafted throughout the whole neighborhood. Do you know if that's true?
Oh, yes. I can give you first-person account of that. I moved to the junction in 1992, and yeah, for many years there was this sort of ugly, singed meat smell that would just sort of hang in the atmosphere for hours on end.
So that must have also helped contribute to the changes in the neighborhood, not to have that kind of hanging over people's heads anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you could drink and you could breathe. It was a better place to be.
Now, do you have any more personal favorite stories about the history of the Junction?
I have a favorite Junction story that only fits tangentially, and that's that the Junction ironically begins as a collection of taverns, and one of the earliest taverns was the Peacock Tavern, and it's here that in 1837 William Lyon Mackenzie and 40 men ride into town and rob the Royal Mail as he's en route to escaping after the failed insurrection that he led down Yonge Street.
Yeah, and so for our international listeners, could you just explain who William Lyon Mackenzie is?
In 1837, William Lyon Mackenzie is a former mayor of Toronto. He's a famous newspaper man, and very much a progressive thinking guy, to the point where he believes the family compact, who are the aristocracy in Ontario and in Toronto, are essentially running a plutocracy, that they're, that the rich own everything and control everything. And Mackenzie and many farmers and workers joined together to start the Upper Canada Rebellion, which has a brother movement, if you will, in Quebec with the Lower Canada Rebellion. And these rebellions are unsuccessful, but they lead ultimately to responsible government, the form of democracy that Canada evolves. But Mackenzie himself is an incredibly colorful character, and says, "Canadians, do you love freedom? I know you do. Do you hate oppression? Who dare deny it? Do you wish perpetual peace and a government bound to enforce the law, to do to each other as ye would be done by? Up then, brave Canadians! Now is the day and the hour." But of course, it wasn't. I mean, this was a failed rebellion, and Canadians have always found that peaceful solutions are better. But it does kind of scare the British into believing that maybe they might lose a colony or two, and we start to see Canadians taking control of their own democracy shortly after the rebellion.
And so what's the story of this robbery? How did that come about?
Mackenzie leads the march down Yonge Street. It ends in a very much kind of ragged stalemate, and he knows he's a wanted man. The government is bringing the troops back from Quebec, and the rebellion has lost any chance it has. He needs money to get out of the country, and he wants to know what the government is planning. So he robs the Royal Mail, the stagecoach, manages to get a hold of government dispatches, gets some money, takes some valuables from the people riding on the coach. It's said that they actually steal a suitcase of a female passenger, and this leads to the legend that Mackenzie escapes from the colony dressed as a woman. So this is sort of the beginning of Junction political activism and burlesque, kind of in the same moment.
Is there anything else that comes to mind that you think our listeners should know about the Junction?
Well, maybe the Junction. The word junction means a coming together, and it was the coming together of the railway lines that traditionally have given the town its name, but it also was a coming together of First Nations trails. So this is where Dundas Street meets Annette and the Old Western Road, and I think DuPont comes in there too. And so the people that would have been using these trails would be the Mississauga of New Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the original nations that would have been hunting and traveling through this area.
Now, if any of our listeners are interested in learning more about the history of the Junction, do you have any recommendations for where they could go to do that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the West Toronto Junction Historical Society has collected all of these incredible stories. If this were not in lockdown, I would urge you to visit them in the basement of the Annette Street Library. But of course, listeners around the world can log on to WTJHS.ca, and there are great Junction stories there. And I'd also recommend the two Junction books, The Leader and Recorder History of the Junction and West Toronto Revisited. Both tell some great Junction stories. And the West Toronto Junction Historical Society has an active Facebook page as well, where people discuss the minutiae of Junction history.
Well, Neil, that seems like a good place for us to wrap up our discussion here. So thanks very much again for joining me to talk about the very fascinating history of the Junction.
My pleasure, Dan.
Chasing Enlightenment was written and narrated by Daniel Monroe. Audio production and editing by Carolyn Smiley. Additional research and voiceovers by Robert Monroe. Artwork and web design by Megan Hilario. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen. You can find more information about the show and ways to support us at chasingenlightenment.net. Contact us at chasingenlightenment@gmail.com. For mental health support in Canada, visit wellnesstogether.ca or text 686868 for immediate help. Those seeking to leave abusive relationships can visit endingviolencecanada.org.